Imagine a city of two faces, a sprawling metropolis where the air itself feels like a thick, heavy curtain of coal smoke and river mist. This is Victorian London, a place of rigid corsets and even more rigid social rules, where the elite walk with polished canes and a sense of absolute moral superiority. But as the sun dips below the horizon and the gas lamps flicker into life, another world begins to breathe. It is a world of shadows, of narrow, winding alleyways that smell of stale beer and damp stone, where the sounds of clinking glasses and raucous laughter spill out from behind heavy oak doors. This is the hidden heart of the empire, the secret taverns and gin palaces where the masks of Victorian propriety are finally dropped. Before we descend further into these forgotten depths of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel to stay with us as we uncover the strange and silent stories of the past. The Victorian era is often remembered for its grand architecture and its strict devotion to progress, but for the millions of workers who fueled the industrial engine, life was a relentless cycle of grime and exhaustion. For a laborer in the mid-1800s, home was often a cramped, cold room shared with multiple families, a place where the walls sweated with dampness and the air was stagnant. The pub, therefore, was not merely a place to drink, it was a sanctuary. It was the only place where a man or woman could find warmth, a bright light, and the simple human comfort of a conversation that wasn't dictated by a factory foreman. These pubs were the social cathedrals of the working class. They were lit by magnificent glass chandeliers and decorated with etched mirrors that reflected a golden glow, a stark contrast to the gray, soot-stained world outside. In these spaces, the social hierarchy of London began to blur. A dock worker might find himself leaning against the same brass rail as a struggling poet or a sailor just returned from the Orient, all of them seeking the same thing, a temporary escape from the crushing weight of reality. The obsession with gin, or mother's ruin as it was infamously called, was a defining characteristic of this era. Unlike beer, which was seen as a nutritious staple for the working man, gin was a fiery, potent spirit that offered a much faster route to oblivion. The gin palaces of the Victorian age were architectural marvels designed specifically to lure people in. They used the newest technology of the time, plate glass and brilliant gas lighting, to create a sense of opulence that the poor could never dream of experiencing elsewhere. When you stepped inside a gin palace like the Princess Louise or the Salisbury, you weren't just entering a bar, you were entering a dream. The ceilings were high, the woodwork was intricately carved, and the barmaids were dressed in their finest attire. For the price of a few pennies, even the most destitute Londoner could feel, for a fleeting hour, like they were part of something grand. But this grandeur had a dark side. The ease with which one could lose themselves in the blue ruin led to a social crisis that horrified the Victorian middle class, sparking a war between the temperance movements and the thriving drinking culture of the slums. As the fog rolled in from the Thames, it acted as a physical barrier between the respectable world and the hidden pubs. These alleyways were so narrow that a person could reach out and touch the walls on either side, and it was in these crevices that the most interesting stories were born. Behind the fog-covered windows of a tavern in East London, travelers would gather to share news from the far corners of the British Empire. You might hear a sailor describing the spices of India or the heat of the African coast, his voice hushed as he leaned over a pot of porter. These pubs became information hubs, the social media of the 19th century, where newspaper reports were read aloud to those who couldn't read, and political radicalism was whispered over pipes of tobacco. The smoke-filled rooms weren't just filled with fumes, they were filled with ideas, grievances, and a shared sense of community that the authorities feared and the people craved. The transition from the 18th century alehouses to the Victorian gin palaces marked a shift in the very soul of London's nightlife. The old taverns were often quiet, domestic spaces, but the new palaces were industrial-scale environments designed for high-volume consumption. This change reflected the pace of the city itself, faster, louder, and more anonymous. Yet despite the chaos, there was a code of conduct within these hidden walls. There were snugs, small private booths where one could drink in relative secrecy, shielded from the eyes of the general public. Here business deals were struck, marriages were toasted, and grief was shared in quiet sobs. The diaries of the time reveal a deep emotional connection to these places. A clerk might write of his favorite corner in a pub near Fleet Street as the only place where he felt truly like himself, away from the watchful eyes of his employer and the judgment of a society that demanded constant perfection. The hidden pubs of Victorian London were more than just businesses. They were the living, breathing archives of the city's collective spirit. As we move deeper into the Victorian night, the air grows thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and the sharp metallic tang of the river. The deeper you go into districts like Whitechapel or Spitalfields, the more the grand facades of the gin palaces give way to the beer shops and penny dreadful taverns. Here the struggle for survival is written on every face. These were the places where clean straw for nothing was a real advertisement, offering a place to sleep on the floor for those who had spent their last tuppence on a glass of spirit. The Victorian drinking culture was not just about pleasure. It was a response to the profound trauma of the Industrial Revolution. When the sun never sets on an empire, it also never sets on the exhaustion of its workers. The gin was a chemical cloak, a way to numb the pain of broken bones, the loss of children to disease, and the sheer grinding boredom of 12-hour shifts. In the middle of this chaos stood the figure of the publican, the keeper of the house. Often a man of significant local influence, the publican was a judge, a banker, and a friend, all rolled into one. He knew who was out of work, who was expecting a child, and who was hiding from the debt collectors. In many hidden pubs, the publican would run a slate, allowing trusted regulars to drink on credit until payday. This created a cycle of debt that bound the community to the pub even tighter. Behind the polished mahogany bar, the publican's wife and daughters often worked as barmaids, their presence providing a rare touch of domesticity in a world that felt increasingly mechanical. However, these women were also the first line of defense against the violence that frequently erupted when the gin took hold of a man's temper. The chucker-out, or bouncer, was a common sight, a reminder that while the pub was a sanctuary, it was also a place where the laws of the street often overrode the laws of the Queen. The Victorian middle class, led by social reformers like Charles Dickens and the leaders of the Temperance Society, viewed these hidden pubs with a mixture of pity and terror. They saw the gin palaces as breeding grounds for crime, revolution, and moral decay. They published pamphlets showing the stages of the drunkard, depicting a man's descent from a respectable citizen to a ragged skeleton in a prison cell. But what the reformers often failed to understand was that the pub was the only institution that accepted the poor exactly as they were. In a church, a beggar was a soul to be saved. In a workhouse, he was a number to be disciplined. But in a pub, he was a customer. He had a name, a voice, and for the price of a pint, he had a place in the world. This sense of dignity, however fragile, was why the hidden pubs survived every attempt to shut them down. They were the underground headquarters of the working class, the places where the secrets of London were kept safe from the prying eyes of the police and the moralists. As the clock towers of the city strike midnight, the fog over the Thames thickens, weaving through the jagged skylines of warehouses and tenements. This is the hour when the truly hidden London reveals itself. Moving away from the bright gaslight of the main thoroughfares, we enter the rookeries, vast, labyrinthine slums where the police rarely venture and the sunlight never reaches. In these pockets of despair, the pubs take on a much more sinister character. These are the thieves' kitchens and fences parlors where the loot from a day's pickpocketing is traded for a night's heavy drinking. In the flickering candlelight of a cellar bar in Seven Dials, criminals of all grades gather to plan their next move. The atmosphere is tense, thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the metallic tang of unsheathed knives. Here, the gin is often doctored with sulfuric acid or turpentine to give it a sharper kick, a chemical cocktail that slowly burns the senses and turns desperate men into ghosts of their former selves. The diaries of the era speak of the flash houses, pubs that were notorious for being the headquarters of the London underworld. To the outside world, they looked like any other dilapidated tavern, but inside, they were the nerve centers of a shadow economy. A young boy, no older than 10, might sit in the corner of such a place, watching and learning the trade of the artful dodger. He sees the older men counting gold watches and silk handkerchiefs stolen from the pockets of wealthy gentlemen in the West End. The pub provided the perfect cover. In the noise and the smoke, secrets could be whispered without fear of being overheard. This connection between the drinking culture and the criminal element created a cycle of poverty and lawlessness that the Victorian authorities found impossible to break. For many, the choice was simple: starve in a cold attic or take a risk in the dark alleys and find solace in a bottle of blue ruin at the end of the night. But the darkness was not just found in the criminal dens, it crept into the lives of the most innocent. The White Fairy or Mother's Ruin earned its name for a tragic reason. In the overcrowded tenements, mothers would often give small drops of gin to their crying infants to keep them quiet while they worked long hours in the sweatshops. This led to a generation of children who were born into the haze of addiction, their growth stunted and their health permanently damaged. The pubs of Victorian London were witnesses to this quiet tragedy every single day. You would often see a mother sitting on a wooden bench, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, sharing her last glass of gin with a toddler. It was a coping mechanism for a world that offered no childcare, no health care, and no hope. The sheer scale of this epidemic led to the rise of the Band of Hope and other temperance organizations that tried to save the children from the clutches of the drink, but for many, the pub was the only home they ever knew. In the hidden back rooms of the pubs in the East End, a different kind of secret was being kept. This was the era of the unsolved mystery. The dimly lit corners of taverns like the Ten Bells in Whitechapel were rumored to be the haunts of figures like Jack the Ripper. The anonymity of the pub culture, the way a man could walk in, drink in silence, and vanish into the fog, provided the perfect shield for the predators of the night. Patrons would huddle together, whispering about the latest headlines in the penny dreadfuls, their hearts racing with every creak of the floorboards. The fear was palpable, yet the pub remained the place people flocked to for safety. There was a strange irony in seeking protection in the very places where danger lurked in the shadows. This duality is what makes the history of Victorian London so haunting. It was a city of immense progress and terrifying darkness, all contained within the walls of a smoke-filled room. The architecture of the pubs also began to change as the century progressed. The snug became a staple, a tiny, private room with its own separate entrance from the street. This allowed the middle-class clerk or the disgraced aristocrat to drink without being seen by the lower-class patrons in the public bar. These snugs were the ultimate vaults of secrets. Within these tiny wooden boxes, illicit affairs were conducted, political conspiracies were hatched, and the shamed members of society found a place to hide their faces. The walls of a Victorian snug have heard more confessions than any cathedral in London. From the merchant who had lost his fortune in a bad trade to the daughter of a vicar who had lost her reputation,
The snug was a confessional for the secular world. As we look at the sketches and newspaper reports of the late 1800s, we see the transition of the pub from a simple alehouse into a complex social machine. The introduction of the music hall element within pubs brought a new level of energy. A small stage would be erected, and for the price of a drink, patrons could watch a comedian or a singer perform ribald songs about the government and the struggles of the poor. This was the birth of modern entertainment, born in the belly of the Victorian tavern. It was a way for the people to laugh at their own misery, to turn their pain into a chorus that shook the very rafters of the building. But even in the laughter, there was a sense of desperation. The songs were often interrupted by the sound of the heavy police rattle, signaling a raid or a fight outside, reminding everyone that the world beyond the door was still a cold and unforgiving place. As the Victorian era entered its final decades, the tension between the underground world and the rising forces of law and order reached a breaking point. The Metropolitan Police, established earlier in the century, had grown into a formidable machine, and their primary target was the very secrets we have been exploring. In the dead of night, the silence of a fog-wrapped street would often be shattered by the rhythmic thud of heavy boots. This was the gendarmerie of the London streets, officers equipped with lanterns and truncheons, tasked with raiding the unlicensed slosh houses that operated in the basements of tenements. These raids were not just about law enforcement, they were a symbolic war on the culture of the poor. The police sought to dismantle the communal bond that the pub provided, viewing every gathering of working-class men as a potential spark for a socialist riot or a criminal conspiracy. Inside the hidden pubs, a sophisticated warning system was developed to counter these raids. A lookout or crow would be stationed at the mouth of the alleyway, often a young child or an elderly woman who appeared to be doing nothing more than watching the fog. At the first sight of a blue uniform, a specific whistle or a coded knock on the door would send the pub into a frenzy of silent activity. Bottles of illicit gin would be shoved into secret floorboards, and patrons would suddenly become sober citizens engaged in quiet conversation. When the police finally burst through the doors, they would often find nothing but a group of men drinking watered-down ale under the dim light of a single lamp. This cat-and-mouse game defined the relationship between the state and the straight, turning the local pub into a fortress of resistance. The psychological toll of this constant surveillance was immense. In the diaries of the 1880s, we find accounts of pub paranoia, where regulars began to suspect that every new face in the snug was a plain-clothes detective from Scotland Yard. This suspicion eroded the very sense of community that the pubs were built upon. The once lively debates about workers' rights and political reform were replaced by hushed tones and nervous glances. The authorities realized that they didn't need to close every pub to control the people. They only needed to make the people fear each other. Yet, despite this, the spirit of the gin remained unbreakable. The desperation of life in the slums was so great that the risk of a prison cell was often preferable to the reality of a starving family and a cold hearth. One of the most tragic aspects of this era was the London fog itself, which was not just a weather phenomenon, but a deadly mixture of industrial smoke and river mist, known as pea souper. In the hidden pubs, the fog was both a friend and a foe. It hid the drinkers from the law, but it also trapped the toxic fumes of coal fires and tobacco smoke inside the rooms, creating a suffocating environment that led to widespread respiratory diseases. A man might enter a pub to escape the cold, only to breathe in air that was slowly killing him. The smoke-filled rooms of Victorian legend were literal death traps, yet they were crowded every night. It speaks to a profound human need for connection, that people were willing to sacrifice their health for a few hours of warmth and fellowship. As the 1890s approached, a new shadow fell over the drinking culture, the rise of the global economic depression. The grand gin palaces, once symbols of industrial wealth, began to show signs of decay. The gold leaf on the ceilings peeled away, and the etched mirrors became cracked and cloudy. The secrets of the pubs became darker as the money dried up. We see reports of suicide pacts made over the last dregs of a bottle, as families who had lost everything in the financial crashes saw no other way out. The pub, which had been a place of escape, was increasingly becoming a place of final goodbyes. The publicans, once the kings of their neighborhoods, were now struggling to keep their doors open, often turning a blind eye to even more dangerous trades, such as the sale of stolen medicines and toxic chemical substitutes for alcohol, just to pay the rising taxes. The role of the barmaid also took on a new, more complex dimension in this period. Often romanticized in songs and poems, these women were the true observers of London's decline. They were the ones who wiped away the tears of broken men and stood their ground against the violence of the desperate. The secrets of the barmaid became a popular theme in the sensationalist press, with stories of young women from the countryside who came to London seeking a better life, only to be swallowed by the dark reality of the city's nightlife. They saw the transition of the white fairy into a monster that tore families apart, yet they were bound by their jobs to keep pouring the glass. Their perspective provides a haunting window into the soul of the Victorian pub, a place of beauty, labor, and quiet, unrelenting tragedy. As the 19th century began its slow, inevitable slide into the 20th, the very atmosphere of Victorian London started to shift. The once clear boundaries between the respectable and the shadow worlds were dissolving under the pressure of a rapidly changing world. The secrets of the hidden pubs were no longer just whispers in dark corners. They were becoming the subject of intense sociological study and government scrutiny. The dawn of the 1900s brought with it a wave of progressivism that viewed the traditional drinking culture not just as a moral failing, but as a barrier to the efficiency of the modern British Empire. The authorities were no longer satisfied with occasional raids. They wanted a total transformation of the city's nightlife. This was the beginning of the end for the true hidden pub, as the flickering gaslight was slowly replaced by the harsh, unforgiving glare of early electricity. In the back rooms of the East End, the old white fairy had become a weary ghost. The legendary gin palaces, once the pride of the neighborhood, were now struggling against new licensing laws that restricted opening hours and banned many of the traditional amusements that had kept the community together. The music hall acts, which had once been a raw and rebellious expression of working-class life, were being moved into grand, regulated theaters. This drained the pubs of their creative energy, leaving them as hollow shells of their former selves. The publicans, who had once been the unofficial kings of their streets, were now being squeezed by large brewery corporations that cared more for profit margins than for the social fabric of the slums. The intimate, secret bond between the tavern keeper and the patron was being severed by the cold hand of industrial capitalism.
Yet, as the official pubs were being tamed, a new and even more dangerous underground began to emerge. These were the shebeens, unlicensed temporary drinking dens hidden in the basements of crumbling tenements or behind the false fronts of laundries and barber shops. If the Victorian pub was a sanctuary, the Edwardian shebeen was a bunker. Here, the alcohol was often home-distilled and lethally pure, and the crowds were composed of those who had been cast out even by the regulated drinking houses. The secrets here were no longer about community or fellowship. They were about raw survival and desperate escapism. The police found these places nearly impossible to track, as a shebeen could be set up and dismantled in a single night, moving like a phantom through the foggy streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. The psychological impact on the Londoner was profound.
There was a sense that the city of light was being sanitized, but only on the surface. Beneath the new, wider boulevards and the clean electric trams, the old heart of London continued to beat with a dark and heavy rhythm. The diaries of clerks and laborers from this period reflect a deep nostalgia for the old days of the smoke-filled snugs and the unregulated laughter of the 1870s. They felt like strangers in their own city, watched by 1,000 eyes, both human and mechanical. The sense of anonymity that the old pubs provided was being stripped away, and with it, the freedom to be hidden from the judgment of the state. Economic pressures also played a cruel role in this transition. The cost of living in London was skyrocketing, and for many, the price of a pint was becoming a luxury they could no longer afford. We see reports of mutual drinking clubs where groups of workers would pool their meager resources to buy a single bottle of gin to share in a cold room, away from the warmth of the pub. This led to a privatization of addiction, moving it from the social setting of the tavern into the isolated misery of the home. The secrets were now being kept behind closed curtains, away from the eyes of neighbors, leading to a rise in domestic tragedies that the Victorian social workers were ill-equipped to handle. The pub had at least provided a level of communal oversight. Now the darkness was becoming absolute. As we look at the historical records leading up to the Great War, we see a city that was holding its breath. The hidden pubs were the barometers of this tension. They were the places where the fear of the coming conflict was debated over guttering candles. Travelers from the continent brought news of shifting alliances and mounting armies, and their words were analyzed by men who knew that they would be the ones sent to the front lines. The secrets were now international in scale. The pub remained the only place where a man could speak his mind about the king or the government without fear of immediate arrest, but even this was changing. The shadow of the informer grew longer, and the old trust that had defined the Victorian drinking house was finally, irrevocably broken. The clock of history was ticking toward an explosion that would forever change the face of the world. By 1914, the secrets of Victorian London were about to be buried under the mud of the trenches. When the Great War broke out, the British government took its most drastic step yet to control the drinking culture, the Defence of the Realm Act. This law slashed the opening hours of pubs and, for the first time, banned the tradition of buying around. The state had finally entered the pub and taken a seat at the bar. For the people who had spent decades finding sanctuary in the hidden corners of the city, this was a final betrayal. The communal spirit that had survived the industrial grime and the Victorian moralists was being dismantled in the name of national security. The gas lights were dimmed even further for the blackouts, and the vibrant, smoky world of the 19th century tavern began to dissolve into a gray, regulated silence. As the men marched off to war, the hidden pubs became hollow spaces filled with the ghosts of those who would never return. The women, who had once stood on the other side of the bar or hidden in the snugs, now filled the factories and the trams, taking on a new role in society. This shift changed the social dynamic of the drinking house forever. The old secrets of the Victorian underworld were replaced by the harsh reality of telegrams and mourning clothes. The gin, once a way to escape the boredom of labor, was now a way to numb the unbearable grief of a lost generation. In the quiet pubs of Whitechapel, the laughter was replaced by a heavy, collective sorrow that no amount of spirit could truly wash away. The white fairy had lost its magic. It was now just a bitter liquid in a cold room. When the war finally ended in 1918, the London that emerged was a different world. The Victorian era was truly dead, and the Edwardian dream had been shattered. The Roaring Twenties brought a new kind of hedonism, jazz, flappers, and bright electric lights. But the old, hidden pubs didn't belong in this neon-lit future. The labyrinthine slums, the rookeries of Seven Dials and Spitalfields were being cleared to make way for modern housing and wide roads. The dark, narrow alleyways where shadows once whispered were being demolished, taking their secrets with them. The legendary taverns where Dickens had observed the human comedy were being replaced by standardized bars that lacked the soul and the grit of the past. The history of the Victorian drinking culture was being paved over in the name of urban renewal. Today, if you walk through the streets of modern London, you can still find traces of this lost world if you know where to look. Some of the old Victorian pubs still stand, their etched mirrors and mahogany bars polished to a high shine for the tourists. But the true secrets, the stories of the war veterans seeking peace, the mothers seeking a moment of rest, and the criminals seeking a hideout, are now just echoes in the brickwork. The fog still rolls in from the Thames on cold winter nights, and for a fleeting second, the modern city vanishes. In that moment, you can almost smell the coal smoke and hear the clink of a heavy glass bottle against a brass rail. You can almost see the silhouette of a man in a long coat vanishing into a doorway that no longer exists. The hidden pubs of Victorian London were more than just dens of iniquity or places of addiction. They were the underground cathedrals of the common people. They were the only spaces where the crushing weight of an empire was lifted, if only for an hour. They were witnesses to the highest joys and the deepest tragedies of millions of souls whose names have been forgotten by history. As we close this chapter on the gin, smoke, and secrets of the past, we remember that every city has a hidden heart, and every shadow has a story to tell. The Victorian era may be a distant memory, but its spirit, restless, dark, and profoundly human, still lingers in the corners of our world, waiting for someone to listen. Thank you for staying with us on this long journey through the shadows of history. The White Fairy may have vanished, but the lessons of that era remain as relevant as ever. If you found this deep dive into the hidden world of Victorian London fascinating, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the untold stories of our past. Sleep well, and may your dreams be far more peaceful than the foggy streets of the 1890s.